you're thinking of buying the GH5 Mark I. It's a pretty legendary camera, but it came out in 2017, which means it's kind of old. So let's figure out, is the GH5 Mark I still worth it, and how does it compare to the other cameras, including the GH5 Mark II that just came out? Why exactly is the GH5 such a legendary camera? Well, for two reasons. One, it has a ton of horsepower at a very competitive price point. Other cameras that cost as much or more than this camera actually don't do a lot of the frame rates and the bit rates that this camera does. So naturally, it makes this camera a better buy. And the second reason is because this camera has so much horsepower, it kind of makes it a Swiss Army knife. There's not a lot that this camera cannot do. So for that reason, let's take a look at exactly what the GH5 does well, what kind of content it's good at making, and what are some of the small drawbacks of using the GH5. Most cameras that do Full HD and 4K often have a trade-off, where either the 4K is really good with the HD suffering, or the HD is really good with the 4K just being okay. But with the GH5, both the Full HD and 4K are good. This camera is extremely sharp and super detailed regardless of what resolution and format you shoot in. And that key piece of information is really useful for figuring out if this camera is right for the kind of stuff you're shooting. So the first thing I want to talk about is product photography and video. I ended up shooting some product photos and videos in studio, and I was really happy with the results. When it came to photos, I ended up shooting the Canon M50 Mark I in studio, and I have to say I was pretty blown away. The images were sharp, crisp, and the colors were surprisingly vibrant. And surprisingly, those photos turned out so good that I ended up using them for a YouTube thumbnail. I think I'm gonna make the switch and actually shoot all of my YouTube thumbnails on the GH5 Mark I now. As for shooting speeds, this camera does 12 frames per second at 20 megapixels, which is the full sensor resolution. But if you drop down your resolution to either 18 or 8, this camera actually does 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, which is blazing fast, but I recommend you stay away from it because for something like this, you really want to get all the resolution that you can. Unless you don't care about the photo quality, I do not recommend getting into those gimmicky modes where you drop resolution. They never really look that good. The experience of shooting photos with this camera is really easy and satisfying. Honestly, 5 out of 5. As for videos, this camera was just as impressive. I got a sharp, clean image. Especially with the 4K, I was able to zoom in and out without any loss of detail. So if you're shooting anything that needs a lot of detail and close-ups, this camera is going to do a great job. This camera does look good for products, but if that's all you use it for, you're honestly wasting this camera, because where this camera really shines is content creation and cinematic video. So what exactly makes this camera so good when it comes to content creation? The answer to that question is kind of nerdy, so bear with me. The first reason is probably one of the most impressive things about this camera. It does 4K in 10-bit color at 422 at 400 megabits per second. Told you it was nerdy. Basically what that means is you're getting all of the colors, the data, the resolution that you would normally find in a proper $4,000 to $5,000 or even $8,000 cinema camera. You are getting a ton of horsepower. If you're somebody that wants to shoot something absolutely beautiful that just makes people lose their mind for YouTube, and you really want to play around with the colors, you really want to make something that looks like a commercial, this camera has you covered. You have more than enough horsepower. It's pretty amazing how much you're getting for such a low price in this camera. And the second reason is this camera does 4K at 60 frames per second, which is pretty rare, especially in the camera at this price point. However, something to note is that at 60 frames per second, it only does 420 at 8-bit color. But that's where the GH5 Mark II comes in, because this camera does 4K at 60 frames per second at 10-bit color in 422. I will talk more about the Mark II later in this video, but one of the big advantages of this camera is the fact that it does 10-bit color throughout all of the frame rates, all of the modes. A lot of times, the GH5 Mark I has to go to 8-bit color or 420 colors simply because it doesn't have the processing power, and the GH5 Mark II fills in all of those gaps. And besides the frame rates, one of the reasons these cameras are so good when it comes to video is the fact that they're really designed with video in mind. A lot of cameras that look like this are really made for photos, and the design really isn't there to support proper video production. Thankfully, Panasonic really thought through the design when it came to these cameras. The ergonomics of this camera, of how it feels in your hands, where the headphone jacks are, where the buttons are, how the menus are arranged, really lend to a positive video experience. Also, both of these cameras have a joystick on the back that makes it really easy to navigate the menus or any of your settings. Plus, both of these cameras have touch enabled for the menus, which makes them really easy to use. I'm kind of surprised I'm saying this, but the ergonomics on this camera are as good as a Canon camera. So if you're someone that's new to cameras, these cameras will not be difficult to figure out. The last reason the GH5 is so good when it comes to shooting content and video is simply because it's great at slow motion. Both the Mark 1 and Mark 2 do 4K at 60, but they also do 180 frames per second at full HD. And at this price point, there are absolutely no other cameras that offer that feature. If you're someone that likes to shoot a lot of slow motion, especially when it comes to YouTube or content creation, slow motion can really help make your videos feel epic. These cameras are a must. However, I do want to mention that in this mode, it shoots at 420 8-bit colors, which isn't the end of the world, but it would have been nice to get 10-bit color at 422. Also, neither of these cameras have a recording limit, which is great if you're shooting weddings, corporate work, or anything where you need to keep your camera running for a long time. However, I do have one major and very serious issue when it comes to shooting with this camera. The dynamic range on this camera isn't great, and a lot of times when I was shooting in bright, challenging conditions, I often found that the highlights were totally blown out or the shadows would just totally go to black. I really wish this camera had a nicer roll-off on the top end and bottom end. If you want to shoot something that has a really soft, cinematic, vintage look, I would not use this camera. It's really not going to give you anything close to a Canon or an Alexa camera. But if you're shooting things like music videos or commercials, where it's not so much about that soft dynamic range, it's more so about having a vibrant and punchy image, these cameras are going to do great. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the sensor size. This camera has a micro 4/3 sensor, which is actually pretty small and is one of the smaller sensors you will find in a camera. The main thing that the smaller sensor will affect is that you have a smaller sensor, therefore less resolution because there's less megapixels. And because it's a smaller sensor, this camera really is not that good in low light. And lastly, you will not get the same shallow depth of field effect that you would get with a larger sensor size. But if you use the right lenses on this camera, the shallow depth of field issue simply goes away. I'll talk more about how to fix that at the end of the video. And this only applies to people shooting something cinematic, but both of these cameras have the option of shooting anamorphic. The GH5 is really like having a mini cinema camera because on top of all the horsepower, Panasonic has even added things like waveform, vector scope, focus tools that you would need on a professional camera. The GH5 cameras are an absolute beast, and despite having a flip out screen, the one thing I would not use these cameras for is vlogging, simply because the autofocus kinda sucks. And I know what a lot of GH5 users are going to say, it's been fixed, there was a firmware update, but despite all of that, I still found that it often just lost my face completely, or it didn't do a good job tracking as I moved closer or further away from the camera. But I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. If your subject isn't moving too much, the autofocus does a fine job. It's really when the subject is moving super fast and the autofocus has to work extra hard. Also, a quick side note, this camera has a really cool feature called an electronic focus pull. Basically, you can set 2 different focus points and the camera will change focus for you. This is really helpful if you're doing some sort of complicated camera move and you don't have a focus puller, or if you're doing product photography and you need the focus points to change during your product shot. This is a super useful feature to have. I don't think everybody's gonna use it, but it's pretty nifty. One place that this camera really shines is the stabilization. This camera will give you smooth footage even if you're not great at holding the camera. The stabilization built into this camera is fantastic. Also, speaking of design and lenses, earlier in this video I mentioned because of the micro 4/3 sensor, you're going to get less of that shallow depth of field effect, but it's really easy to fix. One of the benefits of having a smaller sensor is that the lenses you get for this camera are going to be a lot cheaper because they're going to need less glass, and because of that, you're going to be able to get higher quality lenses for this camera at a much lower price. When it comes to shallow depth of field, the two main things that affect that are your aperture size and your focal length. You're going to be able to get high quality lenses with very fast apertures. On top of that, to really dial in that shallow depth of field look, you want to make sure you're shooting on a tight focal length, somewhere between a 35, 50, or an 85 millimeter lens with a fast aperture and a tight focal length. You're going to get relatively the same amount of depth of field and bokeh as you would on a larger sensor. Last but not least, let's talk about the GH5 Mark I and the Mark II. Which camera is right for you and how do these cameras stack up to the other cameras on the market? The main thing that makes the GH5 so attractive is the price point. There's really nothing else on the market that will give you the same data rates and the horsepower at this price point. And last but not least, is the GH5 Mark II worth over the GH5 Mark I? The price difference is about $250 to $350 depending on where you live. Personally, I do think it's worth the upgrade. If you already have a GH5 Mark I and you want things like 4K 60, all that good stuff, sell the Mark I, get the Mark II. But if you don't have a GH5 at all, I do recommend picking up the Mark II over the Mark I and paying that little bit of extra money. However, there is something that I have to mention. If the sensor size in this camera is an issue for you, you really should consider the Panasonic S5 instead, because for only an extra $200 over the Mark II, you can actually get a full frame camera with way better low light capabilities and basically the same internal horsepower. So if you don't have a camera and you want to get started right now, I recommend picking up the GH5 Mark II. If you have a little bit more of a budget, I do recommend picking up the S5. And if you can wait, if you're not in too much of a rush, I would just wait until the 6 comes out, see how that is, and most likely the price of the S5 will also go down, and I would pick that up at a lower price. Well guys, that's pretty much it for my review on the GH5 Mark I. Is it still worth it? And I have to say, I do think it is. If you can spring that little bit of extra cash, I do recommend jumping on the Mark II.